Autumn 1941. The Sawdust Bread. I thought Leningrad would starve to death. The title of my fear, the sentence that lived in every stomach, was simple. We will die not by bullets, but by hunger. By October, my ration had dropped to 125 grams of bread per day. They called it bread, but it was a gray brick of sawdust and glue, something that smelled faintly of misery and burned wood. Every bite stuck to my throat like guilt. On the streets, the frozen bodies leaned against walls, their faces unburied, their eyes still open. Nobody had the strength to move them anymore. They were becoming part of the city, silent statues of what waited for all of us. When the Badiv warehouses burned, we understood the truth. Hunger was not an accident, it was a strategy. The German bombs had turned our grain into smoke. For 3 days, the air smelled of roasted sugar and ash, as if the city itself were being cooked alive. I watched the orange glow from across the Neva and thought, they are not only bombing food, they are bombing the idea of hope. The fire ate what was left of our reserves, and with it, the illusion that the front was far away. The front was here, inside our empty stomachs. Every morning, I lined up for bread. The queues were endless and silent, a procession of ghosts clutching ration cards like holy relics. People no longer spoke. Words demanded too much energy. Once, a woman collapsed ahead of me, her card slipping from her fingers into the snow. No one bent to help. Not out of cruelty, but because we were afraid that if we knelt, we wouldn't have the strength to rise again. When the wind blew down Nevsky Prospect, it carried not leaves, but paper, fragments of old propaganda, announcements, maybe prayers. Everything mixed with snow until it was impossible to tell what was real and what had been imagined to survive. The German artillery had learned to strike by sound, hunting chimneys that still smoked. Every stove became a target, every fire a signal to the sky. So we lived in darkness and cold, wrapping ourselves in rugs and newspaper, counting minutes between the detonations. Sometimes, when a shell landed far away, the shock wave would rattle the window frames like bones. I remember thinking that the sound of glass breaking was more merciful than the silence that followed. Famine changed people's faces first, then their eyes. The children's cheeks sank, turning round faces into skulls. Soldiers returning from the front passed civilians who no longer looked human, just outlines moving through the frost. I once saw a man gnawing the sole of his boot, boiling it in a tin pot over a candle. He did not look ashamed. Shame was a luxury that had been rationed out long before bread. At night, I wrote in a small notebook I kept hidden beneath my coat, "They want us to die slowly. They want our suffering to be part of their victory parade." I believed it. Hunger was quieter than artillery, but more efficient. It crawled through the streets, entered homes, and lay down beside us. The city had become a laboratory of despair. The Germans surrounded us with steel, our own leaders surrounded us with silence. Both wanted obedience, one through fear, the other through faith. When I woke one morning, frost had grown inside my room, blooming on the walls like white mold. My breath rose in thin clouds. I tried to stand, but dizziness forced me back onto the bed. My body felt hollow. I reached for the small piece of bread I had saved from the day before. It had frozen solid. I broke it with a hammer, the sound like cracking a bone, and chewed until my gums bled. That was breakfast. By the end of October, the city no longer smelled of life. It smelled of smoke, sewage, and rot hidden under snow. I thought of the word obedience again, how we stood in line, marched, saluted, waited. Even in starvation, we obeyed. I began to fear that we would die as we had lived, disciplined, loyal, and silent. The thought terrified me more than hunger itself. That night, I heard distant thunder. No, not thunder. Artillery. The front had moved closer again. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking of the warehouses that once fed us, now ashes. I wondered if the Germans would ever need to fire another shell, or if the cold and the hunger would finish their work for them. I thought Leningrad would starve to death. And as the winter deepened, it felt less like a thought and more like a prophecy whispered through every frozen street. November 1941. The voices on the radio. The radio never slept. Its voice crawled through the frostbitten apartments of Leningrad like an uninvited guest, repeating the same sermons in endless loops. "Comrades, the city stands firm. The enemy will break upon our courage." I listened not because I believed, but because silence was worse. The radio filled the void where screams used to be. It promised victory where all I saw was death. Zhdanov's voice, sharp, bureaucratic, and certain, cut through the static each morning like a knife through frozen air. Hold the line. Stalin watches over Leningrad. We obeyed. What else could we do? Outside, the German artillery sang its own sermon, the kind that ended every promise with an explosion. The NKVD patrols roamed the streets during the lulls between bombardments, hunting those who whispered the wrong kind of despair. A neighbor was taken for saying she'd rather freeze than die for Stalin. The next day, her apartment was sealed. Inside, the bread card still hung on a nail, untouched. The message was clear: the enemy outside kills you with steel, the enemy inside with suspicion. The radio kept calling it heroism. I began to call it survival with handcuffs. Every announcement celebrated the people's endurance, yet the people themselves vanished, either to graves under the snow or into the black cars that prowled the alleys after curfew. One night, I heard them drag a man from the floor above. He didn't scream. Screaming had become useless in a city where everyone heard and no one could help. The next morning, the radio played a march. I kept a small notebook beneath my coat, writing thoughts that could get me shot. Nazism surrounds us to starve us. Stalinism keeps us silent so we die obediently. Each word felt heavier than the pencil itself. Sometimes I thought I could hear the NKVD's boots in my heartbeat. I wrote anyway. Writing was the last act of rebellion left to those too weak to fight and too aware to pray. The cold deepened. The power stations had slowed, their coal nearly gone. At night, the radio's voice faltered, its tone cracking as if even propaganda could freeze. The streets were emptied by the 5 p.m. curfew, leaving only wind and the echo of artillery. The Germans had calculated the exact rhythm of the city's life. They shelled the water lines, the bakeries, the tram depots. Each impact was followed by the same mechanical reassurance over the airwaves: Leningrad is unbreakable. I wondered how many times a city could break before the word lost its meaning. Sometimes, I stared at the dial, imagining the voice inside was human, that perhaps the announcer cried when the microphones were off. But no, the tone never trembled. It was the voice of the state, not a man. It spoke for us, about us, instead of letting us speak. 1,000 dead in the breadlines were a momentary difficulty. The burning of the Badiv warehouses was a temporary setback. The frostbitten corpses on Nevsky Prospect were proof of our resilience. In the evenings, the bombardment returned like a tide. When the shells stopped, a heavier silence followed, a silence that no amount of slogans could fill. Once, during a lull, I turned off the radio. The sudden quiet made my ears ring. From somewhere down the hall, I heard a child humming the melody of a patriotic song, too weak to remember the words. I turned the dial back on. Better lies than ghosts. I began to wonder how many believed the voice anymore. Some still did, they needed to. Belief was another form of ration, issued daily through static. Others had already died inside, their faces blank as the snow. I envied them, sometimes. At least they no longer had to pretend that this was victory. When the night fell, the wind carried the sound of distant explosions over the Neva, and the radio answered with trumpets and slogans. Leningrad will never fall. The phrase echoed between artillery strikes until it felt like a curse, not a promise. I stared at the frozen window, my reflection pale and hollow, and thought, maybe we have already fallen, just inward, quietly, while the world listens to our dying through the radio's endless song. That night, before sleep, I wrote again in my notebook, the enemy starves our bodies, our own rulers starve our truth. I closed the book and hid it beneath the floorboards. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the radio kept talking. December 1941, the first night on Ladoga. They called it the Road of Life. I remember thinking that no name had ever lied so beautifully. It began as a rumor, whispers that trucks were crossing the frozen face of Lake Ladoga, carrying flour and ammunition to the city. When the order came for drivers, I did not hesitate. Anything was better than watching Leningrad die in slow motion. I signed my name, received a set of keys, and stepped into a night so black it seemed to have swallowed the stars. The trucks were lined along the frozen shore like coffins awaiting burial. Each engine idled softly under the blanket of cold, the fumes hanging low and still. We had orders: no headlights, no talking, no smoking. The Germans patrolled the sky, and even the faintest glow could draw death from above. Our only light came from the moon, a pale wound reflected on the endless sheet of ice. I wrapped a rope around the front bumper, our lifeline to the truck ahead. Lose the rope, lose the path, lose your life. The first meters felt like crossing into another world. The ice groaned under the weight, a long, trembling sound that rose through the tires and into my bones. Every few seconds, I thought I heard it crack. My hands gripped the wheel so tight they went numb. Somewhere behind me, a driver shouted once, then nothing, just the muffled splash of something heavy disappearing into darkness. We didn't stop. Stopping meant joining him. The wind came in sharp gusts, flaying the exposed skin on my face. Snow swept across the lake in ghostly patterns, erasing every trace of the trucks ahead. I followed the faint outline of the rope, praying it wouldn't snap. Beneath us was water, deep, black, waiting. Every rumble of artillery from the distant shore seemed to vibrate through the ice, reminding us that the front was not far. They said we were saving the city, but as I drove into that void, I couldn't tell if we were rescuing Leningrad or burying ourselves for it. The convoy crawled on for hours. Time lost all shape. There was only the rhythm of the engine and the breath freezing on my scarf. At one point, the ice began to moan again, a long, hollow lament that made the truck ahead slow down. I could see its rear tires sinking slightly, water seeping through the cracks like dark veins. Someone waved a signal, "Go around." I steered left, heart pounding, the rope tightening like a noose. The sound that followed was not an explosion, it was a breaking. The truck behind me vanished in a shudder of ice and steam. The driver didn't even scream. The lake swallowed him too quickly. We kept moving. There was no ceremony, no pause for the dead. Every kilometer of Ladoga was paved with them. When we reached the far shore, the soldiers waiting there didn't cheer. They just unloaded the crates, flour, kerosene, shells, and waved us back. The return trip would be heavier with refugees, children mostly, wrapped in blankets, eyes hollowed by hunger. That night, though, my truck went back empty. The ice cracked louder under the retreating wheels, as if mocking our survival. I parked on the city side before dawn, too cold to move, too afraid to sleep. Around me, the other drivers emerged one by one from their vehicles, faces rimed with frost, eyes wide with disbelief. Someone counted the missing trucks, 3 gone, maybe 4. No one wrote their names down. The lake had claimed them, and the command preferred silence. Losses expected, they would say later, as if those men had been cargo instead of comrades. As I climbed out, the sky in the east began to turn pale. The city lay ahead, quiet and broken, smoke curling above the ruins. For a moment, I thought I saw the outline of the Badiv warehouses still burning in memory. My hands trembled uncontrollably. I could not tell if it was from the cold or the realization that the road of life was also a road of death, an offering to the lake so that others might eat for one more day. I wrote in my notebook before sleep overtook me on the driver's seat, "The ice keeps secrets. It takes men quietly, without mercy, and yet we return to it each night." Maybe because death there feels cleaner than in the streets of Leningrad. When I closed my eyes, I still heard the cracking of the lake, like bones breaking beneath the wheels. December 1941, scrap metal and children. At the port, the air smelled of fuel, salt, and sorrow. The road of life ended there, where trucks unloaded their frozen cargo into hands too weak to lift. Around the docks stood children with cardboard tags tied to their necks, names, birth dates, addresses that no longer existed. They waited in silence for evacuation across Ladoga, their breath forming clouds that vanished quicker than hope. Behind them, stretchers of wounded soldiers were stacked like debris. There was never enough space on the boats. The officers decided who would go: the young, the useful, the unbroken. The rest remained on the shore, staring at the departing ferries as if watching salvation drift away. I saw a mother pushing her daughter toward a line of evacuees, her own arms trembling with fever. She pressed a note into my glove, a name, a plea. "If she reaches the other side, find her." I nodded, though I already knew promises didn't survive the lake. The first planes came at noon, silver knives cutting through the low clouds. The Luftwaffe. Their engines screamed across the sky before the bombs fell. The docks exploded in waves of fire and ice. Crates shattered, water turned black with oil and bodies. We threw ourselves into cellars and flooded warehouses, the walls shuddering with every detonation. The screams mixed with the roar of collapsing metal, a single, endless sound. When it ended, the snow was red, the air full of the smell of burned fuel and flesh. Children stumbled through the wreckage, searching for anyone still alive. One boy stood beside the smoldering pier, holding the tag of another child. The string had snapped, the owner gone. I picked him up and carried him to the shelter, though he no longer cried. He only asked if the ice would hold tonight. I didn't answer. The next morning, I watched a new group of evacuees board what was left of the ferries. The engines coughed and groaned, the hulls patched with scrap metal. We loaded wounded soldiers after them, those who could still be moved. Behind us, the line of waiting civilians stretched into the fog, endless and unmoving. I looked for the girl whose name was written in my pocket. I never found her. The note remained there, folded and damp, the ink bleeding like the lake itself. That day, I understood that every trip across Ladoga saved someone, and buried someone else. December 1941, the list. The next morning, frost had crept across the windows of the depot like veins on a dying man's hand. The wind cut through the cracks, carrying the smell of oil and frozen metal. On the table lay the new assignment, a typed sheet of paper stamped with red ink. My name was near the bottom, followed by a number and a list of cargo, flour, kerosene, ammunition. That was all. 3 words that meant survival for thousands and death for hundreds along the way. I asked the quartermaster if we could take a few of the sick this time. He didn't look up from his clipboard. No civilians, he said, his voice flat, rehearsed. I pointed to the corner of the yard, where a small group of gaunt figures waited silently, their breath rising in clouds. They had no trucks left for them, no trains, no orders. Just hope. They won't survive another night, I said. The man finally looked at me. His eyes were gray, empty. Then they'll die here, he replied. At least they'll die where they belong. I folded the list and stuffed it into my coat. Orders were orders. But conscience had a weight of its own, heavier than ammunition. When the truck was half loaded, I told the men to leave space near the back. No one asked why. No one dared. As the last crate was tied down, I lifted an old man, barely more than a shadow wrapped in rags, onto the cargo bed. His breath came in shallow gasps, each one a battle. "Hold on," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't. His eyes met mine briefly, glazed but grateful, before closing again. We moved out at dusk. The lake waited, black and endless, its frozen skin glinting in the weak moonlight. The convoy stretched ahead in a single file of dim shapes, ropes linking us like a chain of condemned men. The temperature had dropped below 30 degrees. My hands, stiff on the wheel, felt more like wood than flesh. The engine hummed softly, the sound muffled under layers of snow. I could hear the ice complaining beneath us, a low, resonant moan that seemed almost human. Halfway across, the truck in front slowed. A signal lamp flickered once. Trouble. I eased back on the throttle, watching the taillights bob in the dark. The driver ahead climbed out, tested the ice with a crowbar, then waved us forward again. The path had shifted, the lake was alive, breathing under us. As we moved, the surface cracked with a hollow pop. The sound shot through me like electricity. Every instinct screamed to stop, to turn back, but there was nowhere to go. Behind us, the next truck loomed close, its tires grinding on the same fragile road. The ice groaned louder. The truck tilted slightly to the right. I heard something slide in the back, probably a crate. Or maybe the old man. I didn't dare look. My breath fogged the windshield until I could barely see the outline of the convoy. Another loud crack, followed by a flash of movement in the mirror, a burst of water, a scream swallowed by the wind. One of the trucks had gone through. The others kept going. Always forward. Always pretending we didn't hear. When the shoreline finally appeared, a dark smudge against the snow, I felt nothing but exhaustion. We rolled into the depot under artillery fire, shells bursting miles away, dull thuds that shook the ground. Soldiers rushed to unload the cargo, shouting numbers and orders. I stayed in the cab until my hands stopped shaking. Then I climbed into the back. The old man was gone. His blanket lay crumpled in the corner, already stiff with frost. Maybe he'd slipped out when the truck jolted, maybe he'd died quietly among the crates. I'd never know. There was no time to search, no time to record his name. The list on my desk would still say flour, kerosene, ammunition. It would not mention him. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Command counts the cargo, not the souls." The lake takes what the paperwork forgets. Outside, the wind howled over the frozen water, erasing every trace of the path we had carved. The road of life began anew each night, as if mocking the men who tried to remember where it last existed. January 1942, the ice that speaks. By the new year, the lake had become a language of its own. It spoke in cracks and murmurs, in low, shuddering sighs that carried through the steering wheel and into my bones. I learned to listen, to tell by sound where the ice was thin, where death waited just below the surface. It was strange how quickly fear became instinct. I no longer trusted my eyes. I trusted the voice of the ice. Each night, we drove the same route, invisible except to those of us who had memorized every landmark, the half-sunken tree trunk, the patch of darker frost that meant danger, the twisted wreckage of a truck frozen upright like a monument to the men who had disappeared beneath it. The road changed daily, the wind erased it, the shells shattered it, and we redrew it with our tires and our prayers. I could feel my fingers dying one by one. The cold chewed through gloves and skin, until I no longer knew if I was gripping the wheel or just willing my hands to stay attached. We drove in silence. Talking wasted heat, and besides, what was there left to say? Each man carried his own ghosts. When the wind blew right, I could hear the faint echo of explosions across the far shore, the German artillery testing its aim, searching for the convoy lines they could not see. Every shell that landed near the road made the ice tremble like a living thing. Behind me, the city was devouring itself. Word spread that people were boiling wallpaper for the starch, grinding bones for flour, eating glue, soap, and sometimes worse. The ration bread now contained sawdust and cellulose, and even that was worth more than a man's life. Once, a woman offered me her wedding ring for a half loaf. I told her I had none. She didn't cry, didn't even curse me, just walked away into the snow and disappeared. I don't know if she made it home. At the depots, the trucks lined up in long, frozen queues. The soldiers there looked half dead, their faces wrapped in scarves stiff with frost. The air reeked of gasoline, sweat, and despair. We were told to load faster, drive faster, deliver faster, as if speed could outpace hunger. But haste was what the ice hated most. 2 extra trucks, 1 wrong turn, a single moment of impatience, and the lake would open its mouth. One night, as I crossed near the middle stretch, I heard that sound again, a long, drawn-out crack like a rifle shot that never ended. The truck behind me blinked its headlamp twice, the signal for danger. I slowed, trying to read the ice beneath the tires. A dark patch widened ahead. I veered slightly left, feeling the truck shudder as the frozen crust flexed under the weight. The driver behind me didn't have time. His front wheels plunged through, followed by the rest in an instant of terrible silence. No explosion, no scream, just the hiss of water swallowing fire. We kept moving. We had to. The living were responsible for pretending that the dead still followed. When I reached the opposite shore, I looked back once. The sky was clear, the stars bright above the lake, and for a second, I thought I could hear something beneath the wind, a faint knocking, rhythmic, desperate. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe the ice was still speaking, reminding me that every crack was a name, every whisper a warning. I stepped out of the cab, my legs barely obeying me. The officer at the depot shouted for the cargo logs, his voice thin with authority and exhaustion. I handed him the papers, unable to meet his eyes. Around us, men unloaded crates of ammunition, their movements mechanical, their faces blank. Behind the depot, the horizon burned faintly where the Germans shelled the southern shore. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "The lake talks." It tells me who it has taken and who it will take next. I keep driving anyway. Perhaps I'm afraid that if I stop, it will call my name too. When I closed my eyes, I heard it again, the deep, resonant groan of ice shifting under endless weight, speaking the only truth that remained in that winter of 1942, Survival was just another word for waiting one more night before the lake decided to answer. January 1942. The Police of Fear. Daylight in Leningrad no longer meant safety. The sun, when it appeared, only revealed the cruelty more clearly. The outlines of frozen corpses along the pavements, the hollow sockets of windows shattered by artillery, the footprints that stopped abruptly where someone had fallen and never risen again. And then there were the patrols, the men of the NKVD, wrapped in greatcoats, rifles slung across their chests, eyes colder than the wind off the lake. They were not looking for Germans. They were looking for us. It started quietly. Whispers spread that some people had been caught hoarding bread, trading ration cards, or buying flour on the black market. Hunger had erased all law except one: survival. Yet the NKVD treated survival like treason. They came to our building one morning, boots pounding the stairwell like a drumbeat. My neighbor, a widow named Klavdia, was dragged out by two soldiers for speculation. Her crime was swapping her dead husband's coat for half a loaf. She screamed once, and then the door shut. I never saw her again. The radio called it discipline in the face of adversity. The command called it restoring order. But on the streets, we called it what it was: fear. People vanished daily, swallowed not by bombs or hunger, but by the quiet knock at night. Families learned to burn their notebooks, to destroy extra ration cards, to speak only what could not be used against them. Hunger had taken our bodies. Fear took whatever was left of our souls. I began to keep my notebook hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the depot. Writing had become dangerous. Too many words could cost a life. Still, I wrote, it is not enough to survive the siege. One must also survive those who claim to protect the city. Each sentence felt like smuggling contraband across a border. When I drove across the lake at night, I almost felt free. Out there, under the endless dark, the only law was the ice. It did not judge, did not accuse. If it broke beneath you, it did so honestly. The air smelled of oil and salt, not suspicion. I preferred that kind of danger. At least death there wore a uniform of water and cold, not the red star of authority. But even the lake could not silence the echoes of the city. One night, when I returned from a convoy, the guards at the checkpoint stopped us. They inspected every truck, searching not for contraband, but for people. One driver had tried to smuggle his wife out. She was found hidden beneath sacks of flour, already dead from the cold. The guard's voice was flat when he said, "One less mouth to feed." No one answered. We just stood there in the snow, staring at the shape beneath the tarp, each of us silently wondering if love itself had become an offense. Back in the city, I saw children rummaging through garbage piles for frozen scraps. A few weeks earlier, the NKVD had shot a man for stealing a horse carcass from the street. Now, there were no horses left to steal. Hunger had stripped Leningrad bare, of animals, of decency, of trust. Only fear multiplied. Everywhere, posters proclaimed, "Not one step back." The same slogan echoed in our heads when the patrols passed. None of us dared take a step sideways, either. The front had two faces now, one of iron, one of shadow. We were fighting both, and losing to both. That evening, as I parked my truck near the depot, I saw a soldier crying quietly behind a fuel barrel. His uniform bore the insignia of the NKVD. I looked away. In this city, even pity could be fatal. When I returned home, my building was quieter than usual. The door to Klavdia's apartment hung open, her room already stripped of belongings. Her teacup sat frozen to the windowsill, filled with snow. I closed her door gently and went to my room. That night, I wrote in my notebook, "Some men fear the Germans. I fear the men who speak my language and knock on my door." Outside, the patrol's boots echoed through the courtyard, fading slowly into the dark. I waited until silence returned. Then I packed my things, ready for another night on the lake, because out there, at least, the enemy's uniform was easier to recognize. January 1942. The house without windows. The school was barely standing, its roof patched with tar, its windows sealed with planks and frost. I had been ordered to deliver flour there, a rare task that felt almost holy in a city that had forgotten warmth. Inside, the classrooms smelled of smoke and rot. The blackboard still bore half-erased arithmetic problems, ghostly white against the soot. Beneath it, rows of children sat wrapped in rags, their faces pale, eyes wide and dry. They clapped softly when we entered, the way starving men pray before a meal. The teacher, a woman with gray hair and cracked lips, greeted me with a nod. Her voice was hoarse, almost gone. "You're the first to come in 2 weeks." I set the sacks down near a broken piano. The flour dust rose like holy smoke. The children reached toward it, not to eat, but to touch, to make sure it was real. I watched them tear crumbs from crusts as if they were jewels. One boy offered half his piece to a friend and smiled with cracked lips that bled. They still shared, even when sharing meant less life. That simple act hurt more than the cold ever could. Near the door, an old man stirred a pot over a candle flame. The smell was faint, sweet, glue and something bitter. "Carpenter's paste," he said when I looked at him. "Better than nothing." He laughed once, a hollow sound that turned into coughing. When he wiped his mouth, the handkerchief came away red. I leaned against the wall, staring through the boarded window. The light that slipped through the cracks looked almost golden. For a moment, I imagined summer, the smell of bread, the sound of trams, the color of living skin. Then the wind howled outside, and the illusion shattered. As I left, the teacher took my hand. Her skin was ice. "Tell them we still exist," she whispered. I nodded, though I didn't know who "them" was anymore, commanders, gods, or ghosts. Outside, the lake groaned in the distance, calling me back. The truck's engine stuttered to life, coughing smoke into the gray sky. In the mirror, I saw the school fade into the snow, its roof sagging, its windows blind. That night, I wrote, even without windows, they still look toward the light. Then I closed the notebook and listened to the ice, wondering how much longer any of us could pretend to see it. January 1942. Bones in the wind. By mid-January, the city had stopped pretending to live. The streets were littered with what the snow could not hide: arms, legs, shapes that once had names. The sleds of the dead moved through Leningrad in slow processions, pulled by men too weak to speak, too numb to weep. Their cargo was stacked like cordwood, frozen into silence. I remember thinking that even the crows had left. There was nothing left here worth eating. The wind came from the gulf, sharp as a blade. It lifted the powdery snow and the smell of decay together, scattering them across the city. We called it the white wind, though there was nothing pure about it. It tasted like ashes and iron. The Germans had tightened their ring around us, shelling by day, starvation by night. The siege was no longer a battle. It was an experiment in how long human beings could exist without becoming entirely ghosts. I saw soldiers in the streets with rifles slung low, their boots wrapped in rags, their faces cracked by cold. They looked no stronger than the civilians they guarded. On Nevsky Prospect, a cart overturned, spilling bodies onto the pavement. No one stopped to help. There was no outrage left in us, only a dull rhythm of endurance. That afternoon, I drove another convoy of supplies from the lake. My truck wheels rolled past corpses frozen mid-step, their shadows burned into the snow. Every corner was a grave, every doorway a tomb. The air no longer smelled of smoke or soup or life, just the chemical bite of frost and the sweetness of rot. At a checkpoint, a soldier asked for my papers. His hands trembled so badly he dropped them into the snow. When he bent to pick them up, I saw how thin he was under the uniform. "Keep moving," he said, voice cracking. Behind him, a sign read "Leningrad will not fall." I stared at it and thought, it already has. That night, in the depot, someone counted 3,000 dead found in the streets that day alone. I didn't write it down. Numbers were useless now. The wind howled outside, sweeping across the ice and through the broken buildings, carrying away what was left of our voices. I wrote in my notebook, "The Germans kill us with hunger. Our leaders feed on our endurance. Between them, the wind gathers the bones." Then I blew out the lamp, and the darkness settled like ash. July 1942, Order 227. The rumor came before the paper. We heard it in the whispers of soldiers too afraid to say it aloud. Not one step back. When the official order reached us, it was no longer a rumor, it was a verdict. Anyone retreating without command would be shot on sight. Behind the front, new blocking detachments waited with pistols drawn, their job to shoot the men who dared to survive by running. The line between courage and execution had vanished. The front near Ladiga had turned into a swamp of blood and slush. The ice was gone, replaced by mud that swallowed trucks and men alike. Every step forward meant losing someone to the water, to shrapnel, or to despair. The Germans shelled without rest, their artillery walking across the horizon like thunder made of iron. Above us, Stukas screamed through the clouds. Below, the ground shook with every impact. I drove a supply truck to the edge of the lines. Flour, shells, fuel, all things that kept the machine alive, even as it devoured us. At the checkpoint, an NKVD officer stopped me. His uniform was spotless, his face clean, untouched by hunger or fear. "If you turn back," he said coldly, "we will shoot you before the Germans do." Then he stepped aside, and I drove on, wondering which bullet would be kinder. The road ahead was chaos. Wounded soldiers stumbled through the smoke, faces blackened by soot. Some crawled, dragging rifles they could no longer lift. Others simply sat in the mud, staring at nothing. The air was thick with the smell of cordite and burnt flesh. Somewhere in that inferno, a man screamed for his mother. Somewhere else, another shouted, "Forward!" But his voice was lost in the roar. That night, when I returned to the depot, I found the bullet casings of discipline piled beside the gate. No one spoke about them. They were proof of obedience. Proof of order. I wrote in my notebook, "We are surrounded not just by Germans, but by our own shadows." The order says not one step back, but I have nowhere left to go forward. Then I sat behind the wheel, staring at the empty road ahead. The echo of gunfire carried across the lake like a heartbeat, steady and merciless, reminding me that in this war, even survival could be considered treason. Autumn 1942, the stranger in the passenger seat. That night, the cold came early. The convoy assembled under a moon dimmed by smoke, engines muttering in the dark. When I climbed into my truck, someone was already sitting in the passenger seat, a soldier wrapped in a greatcoat crusted with ice. His face was hidden under the shadow of his helmet, his breath visible in the freezing air. "Schlüsselburg," he said quietly. The name hung in the cabin like a prayer and a curse. That shattered town on the Neva had become myth, our unreachable gate, the point where the siege might finally break. No one ever went there and returned. We drove without lights, following the ghostly outline of the truck ahead. The soldier beside me didn't move. His hands rested on his rifle, his eyes fixed on the horizon. When the wind shifted, I caught the smell of blood beneath the frost. He was wounded, badly. Still, he sat upright, a statue of stubbornness and fever. Artillery flared on the far bank, painting the ice in flashes of orange and white. The road groaned beneath us. Each crack sounded like a heartbeat. For hours we moved in silence, two shadows within a larger darkness. Near dawn, his head slumped against the window. I touched his shoulder, but there was no answer. His breath had stopped, his eyes still open, reflecting the pale light of the coming morning. I drove the rest of the way with him beside me, the silence between us heavier than any cargo I had ever carried. When I reached the shore, I left him in the cab, hands folded, eyes closed at last. I wrote in my notebook, he spoke one word, Schlüsselburg, and died facing it. Perhaps that is all a soldier can do, aim his body toward an impossible place, and keep moving until he breaks. Spring 1942, outline of a trick. When the thaw came, it did not bring relief, only mud. The lake lost its hard certainty, turning back into water that swallowed wheels and hopes alike. Convoys halted, trucks rusted where they stood, and the city waited, half alive, half rotting. Hunger still ruled, though the bread rations had climbed by a few grams, Stalin's illusion of mercy. Rumors began to circulate among the drivers, whispered between coughs and gulps of black water. New routes, floating bridges, hidden depots on the southern shore. Some said the command was building ferries out of barges camouflaged with reeds. Others spoke of tracks being laid in secret, of rails stretching toward the Neva under cover of darkness. No one knew what to believe. I started noticing details, the piles of timber near the docks, the engineers measuring distances, officers pacing with maps that disappeared into their coats. Everything was happening quietly, as if the city itself was being rebuilt underground. When I asked a sergeant what was going on, he only smiled. "They want us alive," he said. "Just alive enough to fight later." That night, I wrote in my notebook, Perhaps the real plan isn't victory. It's survival in installments, feeding us crumbs so the statistics look heroic. Each day, new signs appeared. Barrels of fuel hidden under tarps, wooden pontoons stacked like coffins, soldiers training with boats in the dark. The road of ice was gone, but something else was taking shape, a plan no one was allowed to name. I began to call it the trick. It wasn't bravery keeping us alive. It was calculation. Someone far above the hunger had decided exactly how much we could endure without dying. When the wind carried the smell of wet earth and thawing corpses, I knew spring had arrived. And with it, a new kind of deception, one that promised hope, but smelled of strategy. Autumn 1942. Preparations beneath the mask. By the time the leaves turned to ash and the nights lengthened again, the city began to hum with secret purpose. The famine had not ended, but the silence had changed tone. It no longer felt like surrender but like waiting. The officers at the depots spoke softly, their words trimmed of meaning. Orders came wrapped in mystery. Move the fuel, reinforce the pontoons, count the barges twice. No explanations, only the steady pulse of preparation. I saw engineers working in the mist, laying telephone cables along the frozen earth, their breath rising like smoke. At first, I thought it was just more defense work, but soon it became clear, this was something larger. Pilings of steel rails appeared overnight, stacked beside the Neva like bones of an unfinished creature. Soldiers were drilling with boats long after dark, their oars muffled, their shouts swallowed by the fog. When I asked what for, a sergeant grinned but said nothing. "You'll see soon enough," he murmured, the kind of smile men wear when they've already seen too much. I hated that smile. It was the smile of someone who knows that others will die for a plan he's not allowed to explain. The command spoke of maskirovka, deception. Camouflage was everywhere. Nets covering artillery, false lights to confuse the Luftwaffe, fake depots built just to be bombed. Even our hunger became a weapon, our silence a shield. I understood then that Stalin's genius wasn't courage, it was manipulation. He was turning our suffering into strategy. The nights grew colder again, the air heavy with snow and secrecy. Trucks rolled under tarps, their cargoes unknown. The men whispered a single name in the dark, Schlüsselburg. No one dared say more. I wrote in my notebook, when lies are used to build a bridge, truth becomes another casualty. January 1943, Iskra. At dawn on January 12, 1943, the sky erupted. For weeks, we had sensed it, the tension, the quiet shifting of troops, the strange optimism no one dared name. And then it came, Iskra, the spark. The artillery opened first, a roar so vast it felt like the earth itself was cracking apart. The horizon flashed white and red as hundreds of guns unleashed their fury toward the German lines at Schlüsselburg. The ground shook beneath my truck. Even the ice on the Neva trembled, as if the river itself had woken from hibernation. We drivers were ordered to follow the barrage, carrying ammunition and stretchers across the frozen crossings. The air was thick with smoke, snow, and iron. "Forward!" someone shouted, not to me, but to the world. Soldiers poured from the trenches, silhouettes swallowed by fog and flame. Across the river, the German guns answered, tearing holes in the ice. Men vanished into those holes, their screams cut short by the water's silence. I saw one platoon advance until the snow turned black under their boots. Still, they moved, some crawling, some dragging the wounded, all obeying that single word, forward. For the first time in months, I felt something like heat, terror mixed with hope, the kind that burns from the inside. By evening, word spread through the ranks. They had met our troops from the east. A corridor, narrow, fragile, soaked in blood, was open. The siege was not broken, but it had been pierced. We called it a victory, though the snow was full of bodies. That night, I stood on the riverbank, the ice cracked and red beneath my boots. The air smelled of gunpowder and human steam. I wrote, "The spark has come, but it burns through flesh before it gives light." Then I watched the horizon flicker, wondering how long that light would last. February 1943, rails in the snow. The victory at Schlüsselburg had opened a wound through which life could crawl back. They called it a corridor, but it was barely 4 kilometers wide, narrow, frozen, and shelled every hour. Still, through that strip of death we began to build. Engineers worked day and night, hammering rails into permafrost, laying sleepers over swamps and corpses alike. Every meter gained was paid for with blood. I drove supplies to the site, my truck bouncing over frozen mud, the sky always screaming with German shells. Yet the men didn't stop. They said nothing, just hammered and lifted, until their hands bled. By mid-February, the first train arrived, its whistle thin and cracked, a sound both pitiful and holy. Smoke curled above the snow like the city's first breath in months. People wept when they saw it, though none smiled. It carried sacks of flour and barrels of kerosene, and the promise that maybe we would not die that winter. The Germans bombed the line constantly, but we rebuilt it faster than they could destroy it. I drove until I fainted, until the world blurred into snow and steel. I wrote, "The rails are veins. They feed the city, slowly, painfully, but they feed." March 1943, 2 crimes, 1 city. The trains still came, and Leningrad still starved. The bread rations rose again, but only enough to keep the living half dead. The newspapers printed words like victory and endurance, yet the streets told another story, one of graves unmarked and courage spent. I began to see medals glinting on chests that had never felt the weight of frost. Officials posed beside the trains for photographs, their boots clean, their faces full. Behind them, the bodies of workers were buried in the snow where they had collapsed from exhaustion. Heroism had become propaganda, sacrifice, a tool. In my notebook, I wrote, "The Nazis tried to kill us with hunger. Stalin used our hunger to glorify himself." 2 crimes, 1 city. I passed a pit where they were burying the latest dead, men, women, drivers, soldiers. No prayers, no names. Just numbers on wooden boards that would soon rot away. The corridor still stood, the train still ran, but I felt no triumph. Only weariness. The lake, the ice, the road, all of it had fed the same machine, grinding life into survival and survival into obedience. I thought, perhaps Leningrad did not survive the siege. Perhaps it merely learned to live like the dead. March 1943, the line that wouldn't break. The day the first full train rolled straight into the city, its whistle echoed like a heartbeat returning after a long silence. Crowds gathered along the tracks, thin figures in torn coats, faces gray but eyes alight. The locomotive crawled forward, its smoke mixing with the winter fog, dragging behind it wagons of bread, coal, and the illusion of peace. I stood by my truck as it passed, the iron wheels screeching on the frozen rails we had built with bare, bleeding hands. Some wept, others saluted. I did neither. I only watched, numb, remembering the men who had drowned beneath the ice, the children left behind on the lake's edge, the neighbors who vanished into basements and never returned. We called it salvation, but I knew better. The road of life had been a road of death too, paved with sacrifice, silence, and calculation. The state would count the trains, not the bodies. When the whistle faded, I sat behind the wheel and wrote my last words. They say the city lived. But it lived because so many did not. The line held, the hunger eased, and the story will be called victory. Yet I know, it was survival bought with the price of souls.